March 16, 1968, Lieutenant William Calley Jr. led a United States platoon in a search for members of Viet Cong. They were unable to find anyone tied with Viet Cong on this mission, but Lieutenant Calley ordered his troops to kill anything that breathes. The U.S. soldiers obeyed his command, shooting over 200 innocent Vietnamese, the majority women, children, and elderly men. These people were thrown about, gathered into groups to be shot at, or even raped before being shot. This became known as the My Lai Massacre. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson saw the incident as it was occurring from the air. When he realized that he was witnessing a cruel massacre of innocent villagers, he decided to take action and landed his plane. After landing, Thompson confronted the soldiers committing this horrendous crime and told his crew to shoot at any Americans who fired. The mass murder came to an end, and Thompson saved at least 11 citizens of South Vietnam. When he returned to base, Thompson reported what he saw, likely saving even more people from being killed in future events. In the aftermath of My Lai, Thompson was seen as a traitor to America and was shunned from society. As for the men who committed the massacre, 25 officers were charged with involvement. Of these men, Lieutenant Calley was the only one convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Still, Calley's sentence was changed to house arrest due to President Nixon's intervention, and he only served 3.5 years of it. By 1970, America's involvement in the Vietnam War seemed to be finally calming down. That is, until April 30th, when the United States invaded Cambodia, attempting to clear out North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supply centers. The invasion sparked huge campus protests. The first general student strike resulted in over 1.5 million students closing down 1,200 campuses. One of the most famous student protests following the invasion of Cambodia was at Kent State University in Ohio. This massive protest led to the burning of the ROTC building, which was home to a military training program. The demonstration only got more violent from there. When the National Guard got involved, they were met by a crowd throwing rocks. Members of the Guard shot at the crowd, wounding 9 people and killing 4. 2 of these were bystanders. Only 10 days after the Kent State Massacre, there was another protest at Jackson State University in Mississippi. The National Guard was again called to the scene. In response to a group of anti-war demonstrators throwing bottles, they fired into the crowd, this time wounding 12 demonstrators and killing 2 bystanders. In addition to a large student response, the invasion of Cambodia lost President Nixon much political support. In a time when Americans were sick of war and ready for America to cease involvement, Nixon's invasion had made it bigger. To make matters worse, Nixon had never asked Congress before invading. On December 31, 1970, Congress repealed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which had been giving Nixon too much power. The invasion also extended the credibility gap for Americans. In June of 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked in the Defense Department. This 7,000-page document revealed that the U.S. government under Johnson had been preparing to enter the war even though President Johnson had promised Americans he wouldn't send troops. The papers also revealed that no plan was ever made to end the war if North Vietnam persisted. This document proved to Americans that the government had been dishonest regarding war intentions, thus extending the credibility gap even further. Even more public support for the war was lost.
Succeeding LBJ, Richard Nixon became the new President of the United States in 1969, and the National Security Advisor was Henry Kissinger. Together, they came up with Vietnamization, which was their plan to gradually remove U.S. troops from Vietnam in the hope that it would cause South Vietnam to take a more active combat role in fighting the war. With Vietnamization, they hoped to establish peace with honor, which would mean despite withdrawing from the war, Nixon wanted to maintain the dignity of the U.S. troops and create a long-lasting peace. He said, "Now that we achieved an honorable agreement, let us be proud that America did not settle for a peace that would have betrayed our allies, that would have abandoned our prisoners of war, or that would have ended the war for us, but would have continued the war for the 50 million people of Indochina. Let us be proud that the 2.5 million young Americans who served in Vietnam, who served with honor and distinction in one of the most selfless enterprises in the history of nations. And let us be proud of those who sacrificed, who gave their lives so that the people of South Vietnam might live in freedom and so that the world might live in peace." While Nixon declared that the U.S. was going to start removing their troops, he secretly ordered for the bombings of Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam. These areas were bombed so that they could destroy supply routes and bases. Following the bombings on April 30th, 1970, Nixon announced that the U.S. had invaded Cambodia and in order to eliminate North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supply centers. After hearing about the invasion, students across the nation began to protest. In order to win support for his war policies, Nixon appealed to the silent majority, which he described as the moderate, mainstream American that quietly supported U.S. efforts in Vietnam. Unlike the silent majority, most Americans did not support the events of the war, and the country continued to divide.
Stalemate in South Vietnam would continue until the United States would begin to lessen its involvement in the war. In 1971, over 60% of Americans wanted U.S. troops out of Vietnam/out of the war. Yet, in 1972, United States troops still remained in Vietnam and in the war. Kissinger, one of Nixon's negotiators, who had been privately meeting with North Vietnam's chief negotiator, had dropped his insistence that North Vietnam withdrew all its troops from South Vietnam before American troops would withdraw from Vietnam. The Thieu regime, however, rejected Kissinger's plan due to alarm at the prospect of North Vietnamese stationed in South Vietnam. Instead, the Christmas bombings began, in which Nixon consistently, for 7 days straight, bombed Hanoi and Haphoing in North Vietnam, only breaking or stopping on Christmas. Following the bombings, public desire, including that of Congress, support for the war became even less, which ultimately led up to, on January 27, 1973, the United States would sign the agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. This agreement stated that North Vietnamese troops would remain in South Vietnam. However, Nixon promised with full force to any violation of this agreement that the U.S. would re-enter the war with full force. On March 29, 1783, the U.S. combat troops left for America and the Vietnam War had ended. In the events following the invasion of North Vietnam to South Vietnam, the United States would remain out of Vietnam despite Nixon's threats from the peace treaty. Another important thing to note about Nixon is his plan to remove U.S. troops from Vietnam. It was a process called Vietnamization, which called for the gradual removal of U.S. troops in order for the South Vietnamese to take on a more active combat role in the war. By August of 1969, the first 25,000 U.S. troops have returned home from Vietnam, and it will continue over the next few years. As negotiations stayed at a standstill, with both South Vietnam and the United States government insisting that the North Vietnamese troops exit the South and that the current leader of South Vietnam remain in power. Meanwhile, the North wanted U.S. troops gone in order to expand a coalition government, which would include the Viet Cong into the South. When the U.S. would begin to remove its troops, Nixon secretly called for a massive bombing campaign against supply routes and bases in North Vietnam. In order to instill fear, Nixon also ordered bombs be dropped on the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia because they held a number of Viet Cong sanctuaries. However, a big part of the reason the Nixon administration took the steps to end America's involvement in the war was that in 1972, the North Vietnamese launched their largest attack on South Vietnam since the Tet Offensive. After the United States' departure from the war, the ceasefire between North and South Vietnam created during the peace treaty collapsed. After several years of fighting, North Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion against South, where the Thieu would ask the United States for aid, as Nixon had promised during the peace treaty. However, America would only provide economic aid and refused to send physical troops, ultimately showing Nixon's earlier threat had indeed been empty. By 1975, North Vietnamese troops and tanks were able to seize Saigon, and soon after, South Vietnam had to surrender to North Vietnam. The impacts of the Vietnam War on the U.S. were colossal. With 58,000 Americans killed during the war and even more injured, it left Americans with a more cautious attitude toward foreign affairs and somewhat questioning whether or not they should actually get involved. Another impact on the government was that the draft was abolished due to the many anti-war attitudes that surrounded it. Another attitude change was more cynical towards the government, and there was all this doubt and a large credibility gap. Again, this is also around the time of Watergate, in which people are starting to not trust what they're being told and not trust the government. Another big difference was that an impact was that veterans were not welcomed home as they had been in previous wars. Many were greeted with indifference or hatred for serving in the war. It wasn't heroic. Nearly 500,000 veterans returned home with post-traumatic stress disorder from everything that had happened, and others abused the use of drug and alcohol. Some even possibly committed suicide. Another impact on the government was the War Powers Act, which stipulated that the president must inform Congress within 48 hours of sending forces into a hostile area without the declaration of war. These new attitudes and acts enabled by the government would affect the policies of war for many generations to come.